He spent 32 years convincing everyone, including himself, that he was too busy to love. Then a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston walked into his town, looked him dead in the eyes, and asked the one question no one had ever dared to ask. What came out of his mouth next shocked even him. And nothing, not the ranch, not the town, not the life he'd spent 3 decades building, would ever be the same again. If you've ever wondered whether it's too late to start over, stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first frost came early that year. Caleb Mercer noticed it before the sun was fully up. A thin white film across the top rail of the fence. The kind that burned off by mid-morning but left the ground underneath harder than it looked. He was already in the barn by the time the sky turned gray, running his hand along the flank of a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg since Tuesday. The animal shifted, blowing warm air through its nostrils, and Caleb made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a word, not quite nothing. The kind of communication that worked better with horses than with most people. He was 54 years old. No. 54 was his father's age when the old man died. Caleb was 32. He sometimes lost track. That was the kind of thing that happened when the days looked the same. He fed the horses, patched a section of the east fence that the elk could push through again during the night, ate cold biscuits standing over the kitchen sink, and was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he heard the wagon coming up the main road into Red Hollow. That in itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the time, barely past 7 in the morning, and the fact that the wagon was coming from the east, which meant it had come through Billings, which meant someone had taken the long way around. Caleb set his mug down and looked out the window. The wagon belonged to Arthur Fenn, who ran the general store and served as something close to an unofficial mayor, though nobody had ever voted on that. Sitting on the bench beside Arthur was a young woman Caleb had never seen before. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for Montana and holding a carpet bag on her lap with both hands, the way people hold things when they're not sure what's going to happen next. Caleb turned back to his coffee. It wasn't his business. He found out about her the way everyone in Red Hollow found out about everything. From Margaret Pruitt, who ran the post office out of a room attached to her kitchen and treated information the way other people treated currency. "School teacher," Margaret said, handing him a letter that had been sitting for 2 weeks. "From Boston, name's Whitlock, Elena Whitlock." Caleb said. 22 years old. Margaret leaned on the counter. "Arthur's been writing to the district office for 3 years about getting a proper teacher. Apparently they finally found someone willing to come." "Willing," Caleb said. "Don't look at me like that. It's a long way from Boston." He didn't ask anything else. He folded the letter from his bank about a pasture loan and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to his wagon. On the drive home, he passed the old schoolhouse, a single-room building with a sagging roof that the community had been meaning to fix for at least 6 years. Through the window, he could see movement, someone inside pushing at something, moving things around. He kept driving. The first time he actually spoke to Elena Whitlock was 3 days after she arrived, and it happened because of a dog. She was walking the road between the schoolhouse and the Fenn's general store when his neighbor's border collie, a half-wild animal named Duke that had no loyalty to anyone and bit without much warning, came tearing out from between 2 fence posts and stopped about 4 feet in front of her, hackles up, a low sound rolling out of its chest. Most people froze. Some backed away slowly. A few women Caleb had seen in town over the years had screamed. Elena Whitlock crouched down, not all the way. She didn't get on her knees in the dirt, but she dropped her weight low and held out her hand palm down and looked at the dog without looking directly at it, and she said something Caleb couldn't hear from where he'd pulled his wagon up short. The dog's hackles went down. It took 1 step forward, then another. Then it was sniffing her knuckles, and she was scratching behind its ear, and that was that. She stood up and looked over at Caleb's wagon like she'd known he was there the whole time. "He just needed to know I wasn't going to run," she said. Caleb wasn't sure what to say to that. He said, "That dog has bitten 3 people." "I know, Mr. Fenn told me." She brushed her hand on her coat. "I'm Elena Whitlock. I'm the new school teacher." "I know who you are," he said. A pause. She didn't seem bothered by his tone, which was more than he could say for most people. And you are? She asked. Caleb Mercer. I have the ranch about 2 miles east. She nodded like she was filing it away. Do you have children at the school? No. Then I expect we won't have much reason to talk, she said, not unkindly, just plainly. And she picked up her bag and kept walking. He watched her go for a second longer than made sense, then shook the reins and drove on. She had 12 students on her first day. By the end of the second week, she had 19. This was the thing that people talked about at the feed store and over dinner tables and after Sunday services. Not just that the school teacher from Boston was pretty, though several people mentioned that too, but that she'd somehow convinced families who hadn't sent their children to school in years to start again. The Halverson boys, ages 9 and 12, who had been helping their father plow since spring and whose mother had declared that book learning was less useful than knowing how to mend a harness. The two Crow daughters who lived at the edge of town with their grandmother and who nobody had thought to invite. A 14-year-old named Tom Briggs who'd been running traps alone since his father left, and who showed up at the schoolhouse door on a Wednesday morning looking like he wasn't sure he was allowed in. Elena let him in. That was the other thing people said. She just let them in. Whoever showed up, whatever they looked like, whatever excuse their parents had given themselves for years, she let them in and gave them a seat and somehow made them believe that whatever was in those books was meant for them specifically. Caleb heard all of this secondhand. He had no reason to go near the schoolhouse. He went near the schoolhouse anyway, about 3 weeks after she'd arrived, because he was dropping a load of firewood at Arthur Fenn's, and the schoolhouse was right there, and it was late afternoon, and through the window he could hear her voice, carrying in that clear way voices carry in cold air. He stopped the wagon. She was reading aloud. Something he didn't recognize. Not the Bible, not anything he knew. Her voice went fast in some places and slow in others, and at one point he heard the children laugh, and it wasn't the nervous laugh of kids trying to please a teacher, but something that had just caught them off guard. He sat in the wagon for maybe 2 minutes longer than made any sense. Then Arthur came out the back door of the store and said, "You gonna sit there all day or bring in that wood?" Caleb brought in the wood. He ran into her again at the river. It was a Sunday, the 3rd week of October, and the cottonwoods had gone gold and were dropping leaves into the current. He was checking the south fence line along the water, a job he could have sent one of his hands to do, but he'd wanted the walk. And she was sitting on a flat rock near the bank with what looked like a stack of papers on her knee, marking something with a pencil. She didn't notice him at first. He almost turned around. He wasn't sure why he didn't. "Papers?" he said. She looked up without startling, which surprised him. "Spelling tests," she said. "Tom Briggs spelled necessary correctly on his first try. I've been teaching for 4 months, and that's the first time anyone's done that. Is that impressive?" "It's a hard word." She looked back at the papers. "Most adults spell it wrong." He sat down on a log a few feet away, which he hadn't planned to do. The river moved past them. In the distance, a pair of geese crossed the sky going south. "You like it here?" he asked. It wasn't what he'd meant to say. He hadn't meant to say anything. She thought about it seriously, which he hadn't expected. Most people, when you asked something like that, just said yes or fine or something to fill the space. "The sky is bigger than I thought it would be," she finally said. "That sounds foolish." "It doesn't. I grew up in Boston. Buildings everywhere. You got used to looking at things that were close. Here," she paused. "Here there's just so much distance. It took me a few days to stop feeling like I was falling into it." He looked out at the water. "Does it still feel that way?" "Less," she said. Now it mostly feels like room." He didn't have an answer for that. They sat there for a while in a silence that wasn't particularly uncomfortable, which was unusual for Caleb, who found most silences with other people uncomfortable. Eventually she gathered her papers and stood up. "I have to get these done before dark. The light in my room isn't good." "You're staying at the Penner place?" "The back room, yes." She tucked the papers under her arm. "Mrs. Penner is very kind. She leaves soup on the stove even when I come in late." "That's Ruth," he said. "Do you know everyone here that well?" "I've lived here my whole life." She looked at him for a second with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. "That must be strange, knowing everyone's whole story." "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes you just know the parts they show you." She seemed to consider that. Then she nodded once, like she'd made a note of it, and walked back up toward the road. He stayed by the river until the sky started turning pink at the edges. Oh. October moved into November, and the cold got serious. The mountain passes started closing. Caleb's hands, he had 3 full-time ranch workers, brothers named Pete and Dennis Rourke, and a quiet Métis man named Louis Beaumont, spent most of their time reinforcing the windbreaks and moving the cattle down from the high pasture. It was the kind of season that demanded everything from you and gave you exhaustion in return, and Caleb was used to that. He'd been doing it since he was old enough to lift a fence post. But this November was different in a way he couldn't exactly name. He noticed it in small things. He would be in the middle of some task, patching a roof section or going through the feed inventory, and he would catch himself mid-thought, thinking about something she'd said. Not important things. The thing about the sky. The thing about knowing only the parts people showed you. Little pieces of conversation that didn't deserve as much space in his head as they were taking up. He mentioned none of this to anyone. What he did do, without quite admitting to himself that he was doing it, was find reasons to be in town more than usual. The feed store, the post office. He fixed a broken step at the church that had been broken since spring because he happened to have the right lumber in his wagon. He dropped off a cord of firewood at the schoolhouse without being asked, left it stacked by the door, and was already back in his wagon before Elena came out to see who it was. She saw him anyway. "Mr. Mercer," she called across the yard. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "The stove in there barely holds heat. This will help." "Wood's no use sitting on my property," he said. She had her coat on but no hat, and her hair was doing something in the wind, and she was looking at him with that same expression he'd seen at the river, something between curiosity and patience, like she was waiting for him to finish a sentence he hadn't started yet. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "The children are at lunch. I have coffee." "I have work," he said. "You always have work," she said. Not as a criticism, just as a fact. He paused. "Yes," he said. "I do." And he drove away. He thought about that coffee for the next 3 days. The thing about Caleb Mercer that most people in Red Hollow understood without talking about it was that he had closed something off a long time ago. He wasn't mean. He wasn't cold in the way that made people dislike him. He showed up when the Halverson barn burned and worked alongside the other men to clear the debris. He lent money to the Briggs family twice in the last 4 years and never mentioned it to anyone. He was reliable and competent and not unkind. But he was alone, and he had been alone for so long that people had stopped wondering about it. He was just Caleb Mercer, who had the big ranch east of town and no wife and no children, and who worked from before sunrise to after dark every day as if work itself was the point of everything. His mother had died when he was 9. His father had raised him with the understanding that sentimentality was a luxury men in their position couldn't afford. There had been a girl once, when Caleb was 23, a woman named Catherine, the daughter of a rancher from over near Dillon, and something had almost happened there, something that felt at the time like the ground shifting under him, and then it hadn't happened, and afterward Caleb had built the walls back up so carefully that even he forgot sometimes that there had ever been a gap in them. 32 years old, no wife, no children, just the land and the cattle and the seasons turning over. He told himself this was fine. He had told himself for so long that he'd almost stopped hearing it. The evening everything changed. He hadn't planned to be at the Fens at all. It was a Friday, toward the end of November, and Arthur had organized a kind of informal community dinner, something he did every few months, dragging tables into the back room of the store and getting Ruth Penner and her daughter to cook, charging nothing and calling it a town meeting, even though mostly it was just people eating together and complaining about the territorial government. Caleb had been to 2 of these in the last 5 years. He came to this one because Louis Beaumont had said something about going and then backed out at the last minute, and Caleb had already hitched the wagon. The room was full, maybe 30 people pressed in around tables, the air thick with the smell of beef stew and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a lot of bodies in a small space. Margaret Pruitt was holding court at one end, telling a story about a letter that had come addressed to someone named Gerald McAllister when nobody in Red Hollow had ever been called Gerald. The Halverson boys were chasing each other around the legs of adults until their father caught them by the collars. Tom Briggs was in the corner, eating very fast with his eyes down, the way someone eats when they're not sure they're allowed to be somewhere. Elena was across the room, talking to Ruth Penner. She had changed out of her teaching dress. She was wearing something dark blue, and her hair was different, not down but not as tightly pinned as it usually was, and she was laughing at something Ruth had said, a real laugh, the kind that moved through her whole face. Caleb got himself a bowl of stew and found a space at one of the tables near the wall and talked to Pete Rourke about the east fence for 10 minutes, and the whole time some part of his attention was on the other side of the room, which was annoying and which he told himself was just because the room was loud. Then Ruth moved away, and Elena looked across the room and found him looking at her, and neither of them looked away immediately, and that was somehow worse. She made her way over eventually, carrying her own bowl, and sat down across from him with the ease of someone who didn't waste time wondering if she was welcome somewhere. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Whitlock." Pete excused himself with the subtlety of a man who had noticed something. She ate for a moment without saying anything. Then, "How are the cattle?" "Fine," he said. "Cold." "I imagine they would be." She looked around the room. "This is nice, these dinners. I didn't have anything like this in Boston. People there stay in their houses." "What brought you here?" he asked. It came out more directly than he'd intended. She looked at him, not bothered. "The position was offered. I wanted to teach somewhere that needed it." "You could have stayed in Boston and taught somewhere that needed it." "Yes," she said. "I could have." She didn't offer anything more. He ate. She ate. Around them, the noise of the room pressed in and then fell away. "The Briggs boy," he said finally. "He seems different than when I first saw him." Her expression changed in a way he noticed. Something behind her eyes went warm. "Tom's remarkable. He'd been working traps since he was 11, taught himself to read from the labels on cans and a Bible someone left at his cabin. He reads better than half the adults in this county." She paused. "He just needed someone to tell him that what he already knew was worth something." "That seems to be what you do," Caleb said. "What?" "Tell people that what they know is worth something." She looked at him directly. Not flustered, just looking. "Is that what you've seen?" "It's what I've heard," he said carefully. "And what have you seen?" He didn't answer right away. The question sat between them and he turned it over. "A woman who's harder to rattle than most," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that. "Most people here think I'm going to leave when winter gets bad enough," she said. "Are you?" "No," she said simply. "Then they'll figure that out." They were quiet for a moment. Around them, Arthur Fenn had started telling some long story about a mule, and half the room had turned toward him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." She looked at him with an expression that was completely unreadable, and for a second he had the strange sensation of standing on unfamiliar ground. "Why have you never married?" The question landed quietly, with no drama, just dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. He felt the usual response rise up, the one he'd given so many times that it had worn smooth from use. Something about the ranch, about the work, about how there simply hadn't been time, about how things had just never lined up right. All of it true enough in the way that incomplete things can be true. He opened his mouth, and then he stopped, because for reasons he couldn't fully account for, sitting in this crowded, noisy room with stew going cold in his bowl, and a woman he'd known for less than 2 months looking at him like she genuinely wanted to know. For the first time in a very long time, the practiced answer felt like a lie he was too tired to tell. He looked down at the table. He looked back up at her. "Because I was afraid," he said. He hadn't known he was going to say that. He wasn't sure he had ever thought it in quite that way, let alone said it out loud to anyone. The words sat in the air between them, and he couldn't take them back, and somewhere in his chest, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time felt, for just a moment, slightly less so. Elena Whitlock looked at him. Not with pity, not with the awkwardness people usually showed when men said things they weren't supposed to say. She just looked at him with that same careful, patient attention she gave everything. The same look she'd given the Halverson boys. The same look she'd given Duke the dog before he'd quieted down. And she said quietly enough that only he could hear it. "Afraid of what?" And he realized, with a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with the crowded room, that he didn't have a ready answer for that one either. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said in years. She didn't push. She didn't fill the silence with reassurances or nervous small talk. She just nodded, very slightly, and looked down at her bowl and picked up her spoon and let the moment settle into whatever it was. The room moved around them. Arthur Fenn reached the punchline of the mule story, and people laughed. The Halverson boys were caught again. Tom Briggs slipped out the side door with 2 rolls tucked in his coat pocket, and nobody said a word about it. Caleb sat with the feeling of having said something true for the first time in a long time, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. He drove home in the dark, the wagon wheels crunching frozen mud, the stars out in that particular Montana way. Not just a few bright ones, but all of them, the whole mess of them, more than any sky had the right to hold. He thought about the way she'd asked the question, not as a challenge, not the way women had sometimes asked it over the years, with an undercurrent of judgment or curiosity about his value as a potential something, just as a genuine question, as if she actually wanted to understand. He thought about his answer. Because I was afraid. He turned it over. He'd been afraid of plenty of things in his life. A blizzard that came in 1878 that killed 14 head of cattle and nearly killed him too. A fire in 1882 that took the North Barn. The slow grinding fear of dry summers and dropping beef prices, and the uncertainty of whether the land would keep giving back what he put into it. Those were real fears, fears with shapes. This was different. This was the kind of fear that didn't have a clear edge you could point to. It was the fear of, what? Losing something? But you couldn't lose something you'd never had. Of being wrong about yourself? Of finding out that the life he'd built with such deliberate care was not quite the life he'd wanted, and that he'd spent 32 years convincing himself it was? He pulled up to the barn and sat in the wagon for a minute. The horse shifted in the traces, impatient. I know, Caleb said. He unhitched the horse, let him in, pulled off the harness, and brushed him down in the dark. A task he'd done so many thousand times that his hands did it without him. His mind stayed somewhere back in that crowded room, at a table near the wall, looking at a woman from Boston who asked questions the way other people use tools. Carefully and with a clear sense of what she was trying to build. Afraid of what? He didn't know. He honestly didn't know. That was the thing he hadn't expected. Not the question, not his answer to it, but the discovery that he'd been carrying something this long without ever looking at it directly. He locked up the barn and went to the house. The stove had gone cold while he was out. He built a fire, set the coffee on, sat at the kitchen table in the dark, waiting for the room to warm. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved across the prairie in that low, constant way, pushing against the windows, finding every gap in the siding. It was the kind of night that made a house feel both shelter and trap. He sat with his coffee and thought about the distance between those two things. The next morning he was in the barn by 5, the same as always. Pete Rourke came in at 6 and gave him a look that suggested he'd been the subject of conversation between Pete and his brother, which Caleb ignored with long practice. He sent Pete to check the water troughs and Dennis to look at the section of fence along the creek that had been giving them trouble. And he spent the morning doing inventory in the feed room, which was a job that required enough counting to keep the hands busy, but not enough to stop the mind from wandering. He wondered if she was at the schoolhouse already. She usually was before 7, from what Arthur had mentioned. He wondered if she'd thought about what he'd said. He wondered if she was the kind of person who thought about that kind of thing, or if she'd filed it neatly away and moved on to the next thing. He suspected she was both, that she held things and moved forward at the same time. He envied that, a little. He didn't see her for 5 days. The weather turned serious, and he was occupied entirely with the ranch. A heifer that needed watching, a section of roof on the main barn that couldn't wait any longer, a problem with one of the drainage ditches that had frozen in an inconvenient place. Red Hollow contracted in on itself the way it always did when the cold got deep, and people moved between their houses and their work and didn't linger. He thought about her anyway. Not constantly. He wasn't a man who had the luxury of constant thought about anything that didn't have to do with the immediate work in front of him. But she was there in the gaps between tasks, in the quiet after supper when he sat at the table with nothing to do for once, in the moment before sleep, which had always been the loneliest part of the day, and which had stayed that way for 32 years. Because I was afraid. He kept coming back to those words. Not with embarrassment. He was past the age where he had much energy for embarrassment, but with a kind of uncomfortable curiosity, the way you might poke at a tooth that started to ache. On the 5th day, he went into town for salt and ran into her at the general store. She was at the counter talking to Arthur's wife Dorothy about something involving ink. Apparently the schoolhouse had run out, and she was asking if there was any way to order more before the pass closed entirely. She didn't look up when Caleb came in, but Dorothy did and made a face that he couldn't interpret. He found the salt. He paid for it. He turned to leave. "Mr. Mercer," Elena said. He stopped. "Would you have a minute?" she said. Dorothy suddenly became very interested in something under the counter. They stepped outside onto the porch, where the cold came at them from across the street. Elena pulled her coat tighter. That coat still too thin, he noticed, and felt a brief irritation that nobody had told her she needed something heavier. And she looked at him directly. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "the other night. I imagine you thought I was being strange," he said. "No," she said, without hesitating. "I thought you were being honest. It surprised me." "Surprised you? Men in my experience don't usually answer that kind of question honestly." She paused. "Or at all." He shifted the salt under his arm. "I surprised myself," he said carefully. "What you said—" She stopped. Started again, more slowly. "You said you were afraid, and then you said you didn't know of what." She looked at him. "Have you thought about it more?" He had thought of almost nothing else for 5 days. "Some," he said. "And?" He exhaled. His breath showed in the cold air. Down the street, someone's dog was barking at something behind the livery. "I think I was afraid of needing something I wasn't sure I deserved," he said. It came out awkward, not the way it sounded in his head, but he'd said it. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything, like it mattered, like she was paying actual attention, not just waiting for her turn to speak. "That's not a small thing to know about yourself," she said finally. "No," he agreed. The wind moved between them. Somewhere a shutter banged against the side of a building. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "The first time. I wasn't sure if you would regret it." "I might still regret it," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something related to one. "That seems honest, too," she said. And then Dorothy opened the front door of the store and told Elena that she'd found a half bottle of ink behind the winter catalogs, and the moment folded back into the ordinary shape of a Tuesday morning in November. And Caleb drove home with his salt and sat with the strange feeling that something had begun that he had no clear idea how to handle. He was 32 years old, and he had spent those years getting very good at knowing exactly how to handle things. This felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a high pasture in early spring, when the snow's been gone long enough that you think the ground is solid, and you take one step and feel it shift just slightly under your boot. Not falling, not danger exactly, but the sudden undeniable awareness that nothing is as fixed as it looked from a distance. He put the salt away. He went back out to the fence line. The work was still there. The cattle were still there. The sky was still enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way it always was in Montana in November. But underneath all of it, in the way a single stone changes what you hear when it drops into a river, everything sounded slightly different than it had before. He didn't know it yet, but the winter had barely started, and what was coming would ask far more of him than any fence or flood or frozen season ever had. The letter arrived on a Thursday, carried up from the billing stage by a writer who'd made the trip specifically because Margaret Pruitt had flagged it as urgent enough to warrant the extra cost. Elena was in the middle of a lesson on long division when Tom Briggs, who'd taken to running errands for the price of a meal, knocked on the schoolhouse door and held it out to her without a word. She knew before she opened it. People always know, somehow, before they open the letter, that's going to change things. There's a weight to certain envelopes that has nothing to do with the paper inside. She excused the class for 10 minutes, told them to practice their multiplication tables, and meant it as much for herself as for them, a task simple enough that nobody would notice she wasn't really watching. And she stepped outside into the cold and broke the seal with hands that weren't quite steady. Her mother's handwriting, tighter than usual. The letters crowded close together the way they did when Margaret Whitlock was trying to fit a hard thing into a small space. Your father collapsed Tuesday. Dr. Allenby believes it is his heart. He is asking for you, though he would never admit it. I do not write this to frighten you, only because I believe you would want to know, and because I am frightened myself, and there is no one else in this house to tell. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, the way you fold something you're not ready to look at again. And she stood very still in the yard with her breath fogging in front of her and the cold working its way up through the soles of her boots. Inside, she could hear the children counting through their tables, 7 times 8, 7 times 9. A small argument breaking out over whether 7 times 9 was 63 or 64, settled by someone, probably Tom, stating the correct answer with more confidence than the question deserved. She went back in. She finished the lesson. She did not let her voice shake, though there were 2 or 3 moments where she had to stop and look down at the slate board longer than the problem required, just to get her breathing back where it belonged. She didn't tell anyone that day. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that the letter alone hadn't quite managed. Or maybe because she needed one more day of pretending the floor under her was solid before she let herself feel it tilt. Caleb found out the way he found out almost everything that mattered in Red Hollow. Secondhand, slightly delayed, filtered through whoever had gotten to the story first. This time it was Ruth Penner, who came by the ranch on the pretense of returning a borrowed lantern and stayed long enough to mention, in the careful tone of someone delivering news they weren't sure was theirs to deliver, that the young teacher had gotten bad word from back east. Her father, Ruth said, heart trouble. She hasn't said much about it, but I heard her crying in her room 2 nights running. Walls in that house aren't thick. Caleb stood in the yard holding the lantern Ruth had returned, not really seeing it. She say what she's going to do? He asked. Not to me. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. But there's only one thing a daughter does when her father's heart is failing and she's 2,000 miles away, Caleb. She goes. The school will manage without her for a stretch, or it won't. And either way, that's not what's eating at her right now. Ruth looked at him with an expression that suggested she understood something about his interest in this that he hadn't said out loud to anyone, including himself. She's got nobody out here who'd go with her. Family's all back there. She'll have to make that whole trip alone, through the passes this time of year, with the trains running thin on the eastern lines on account of weather. That's a hard road for anybody. Harder for a woman traveling by herself. She left it there. She didn't say anything else, and she didn't need to. Caleb stood in his yard for a long time after Ruth's wagon had pulled away. The lantern still in his hand, the cold settling into his shoulders, and something in him that had been quiet for 32 years started making noise it had no business making. He found Elena 2 days later at the schoolhouse, after the children had gone home, sitting at her desk with a stack of letters and a half-written reply in front of her that she'd clearly started and abandoned more than once. There were 3 crossed-out lines visible even from the doorway. Miss Whitlock, he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the rims, though she'd clearly worked to hide it, and there was a tiredness in her face that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. Mr. Mercer. She set down her pen. I didn't expect you. Heard about your father, he said. He didn't soften it or work up to it. That wasn't how he talked, and he suspected by now she'd figured that out about him. Something in her face cracked slightly. Not breaking, but a hairline, the kind that shows you a structure is under more strain than it looks. Ruth, she said. It wasn't a question. Ruth, he confirmed. I'm sorry. It's not your concern. Didn't say it was. He came further into the room, took off his hat out of habit more than ceremony. Just said, I'm sorry. She looked down at the letter in front of her, the crossed-out lines, the words she hadn't been able to make sit right. I have to go back, she said. I know that. I've known it since I read the first letter. She stopped, pressed her hand flat against the desk like she was trying to steady something. I don't know how to leave these children in the middle of everything we've built. The Briggs boy just started trusting that this place wasn't going to disappear on him. The Crow girl's grandmother finally let them come 3 days a week instead of 1. If you go now, it'll still be here when you get back, Caleb said. Or it won't, and you'll build it again. But your father won't wait the way the schoolhouse will. She looked at him sharply, like the directness of it had landed somewhere unguarded. Then her shoulders dropped, just slightly, like some of the fight had gone out of holding herself upright. You're right, she said quietly. I know you're right. I just hate it. Hating it doesn't make it less true. No, she said. It doesn't. She looked back down at the letter. Her hand was still on the desk, and Caleb noticed it was trembling slightly, the kind of small shake that comes from holding too much for too long without putting any of it down. When will you leave? He asked. As soon as I can arrange it. The billing stage, then the rail line east, if the lines are running. It's... She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it. It's a long way. I made the trip out here in summer when the weather was kind. I don't know what it'll be like going back in the dead of winter, alone, with half the country between me and my father's bed. Alone, Caleb repeated. There's no one else to go with me, she said, and there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it, like she was sorry to be admitting a weakness. Ruth has the boarding house to run. Arthur can't leave the store this time of year. I have a little money saved, enough for the fare, but... She stopped herself. I'll manage. I always have. Caleb stood there for some moment with his hat still in his hands, turning something over that had been building in him since Ruth Penner's wagon had pulled out of his yard 2 days earlier. I'll go with you, he said. She looked up at him like he'd spoken in a language she only half understood. What? I'll go with you, he said again, steadier this time, like saying it twice made it more real. 2,000 miles is a hard road for anybody alone, and it's worse in winter. And it's worse still for a woman traveling without anybody to stand beside her if something goes wrong. I've got hands who can manage the ranch through a stretch of bad weather. Pete and Dennis have run things without me before. Caleb. She said his first name without the title for the first time, and something about the sound of it in her mouth landed somewhere in his chest he hadn't expected. You can't just leave your ranch in the middle of winter. That's not a small thing. That's everything you've built. It's not everything, he said. It's a piece of it. The ranch will still be there when I get back, same as your school. People manage. And if something happens to the herd while you're gone, if there's a storm, then there's a storm, and Pete and Dennis deal with it the way I taught them to, and if it's bad enough that even that's not sufficient, then I lose some cattle, and I rebuild. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most things. I've lost cattle before. I haven't... He stopped himself before he finished that sentence. Not sure he was ready to say the rest of it out loud. Not sure she was ready to hear it. She watched him not finish the sentence. She didn't push him to. Why would you do this? She asked instead, quieter now. He thought about all the answers he could give her. Practical answers. Reasonable answers. The kind of answer a careful man gives when he wants to seem like he's done something sensible rather than something that scares him. Because the thought of you making that whole trip alone, worried sick about your father, with nobody to stand next to you if the worst happens. He shook his head slightly. That sits wrong with me. Wronger than leaving the ranch for a few weeks sits with me. And I'd rather live with the second kind of wrong than the first. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose pane in the schoolhouse window that nobody had gotten around to fixing. People will talk, she said finally. A man and a woman traveling together, unmarried, across half the country. You know how this town is. Let them talk, Caleb said. I've lived here my whole life on the strength of what people knew about me being true. I can live a little while on what they think being false. Something in her face shifted then. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than the tiredness that had been sitting there since he walked in. All right, she said. If you mean it. I mean it. Then thank you, she said, and her voice caught slightly on the words. The strain of the last 2 days finally finding a crack to come through. I don't know how I would have managed alone. You'd have managed, Caleb said. You manage everything, but you don't have to manage this one by yourself. The town did talk, exactly as he'd predicted, though not in the way either of them expected. Margaret Pruitt had the news inside of a day. Caleb never figured out how, since neither he nor Elena had told anyone but Arthur Fenn, who needed to know in order to arrange the stage tickets. By the time Caleb went into town to settle his accounts and make arrangements with Pete and Dennis for managing the ranch in his absence, half of Red Hollow seemed to already have an opinion. Some of it was the kind of talk he expected. Sideways looks from a few of the older women, a comment from Dorothy Fenn about propriety that Arthur quickly shushed, a general sense among certain corners of the town that a man traveling unchaperoned with an unmarried woman, regardless of the circumstances, was the kind of thing that invited gossip even when the reason behind it was good. But there was another current running underneath that one, quieter but just as real. The Halverson family, whose boys Elena had brought back into school after years of resistance, sent over a basket of preserves and a note wishing them safe travel. Ruth Penner pressed a small bundle of dried meat and biscuits into Elena's hands the morning she left, told her she'd keep the back room exactly as it was for whenever she came home, and held on to her a beat longer than a simple goodbye required. Tom Briggs showed up at the schoolhouse the day before she left, said almost nothing, the way he usually said almost nothing, and handed her a small carved piece of wood, a rough, lopsided attempt at a bird, and walked away before she could properly thank him. "He's been working on that for 2 weeks," Arthur told her later. "Wouldn't let anyone see it until it was finished. Said it had to be good enough." Elena held the little wooden bird in her palm the whole ride to the Billings stage stop, like it was something that might break if she set it down. The first leg of the journey, by stage to Billings, was rough in the way Montana winter roads were always rough, frozen ruts that jolted the wagon hard enough to rattle teeth, a wind that found every seam in the canvas covering and turned the inside of the coach into something only marginally warmer than the air outside. Elena sat with her hands tucked into her sleeves and her carpet bag braced against her knees, and Caleb sat across from her with his hat low and said almost nothing for the first several hours, which suited them both since neither one had much energy left over for conversation after the morning they'd had, saying goodbye to a town that wasn't sure what to make of them. It was somewhere past the halfway point, with the light going long in gold across the white fields, that Elena finally spoke. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Not for the first time. She'd said some version of it 3 or 4 times already since they'd left. But this time there was something different in her voice, less like gratitude and more like she was actually asking him something. "I know," he said. "Then why?" He looked out the small window at the passing fields, the fence posts ticking by in a slow rhythm, the occasional dark shape of cattle huddled together against the cold. "I told you why," he said. "You told me a reason. I'm asking if it's the whole one." He looked at her then. She had a directness to her that he still wasn't used to, even after these weeks. A willingness to push past the surface of an answer to find out what was actually underneath it. It was the same quality that had gotten the Briggs boy to trust her. The same quality that had gotten him to say things at that crowded dinner table he hadn't said to anyone in years. "No," he admitted, "it's not the whole one." "Then what's the rest of it?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she might have thought he wasn't going to answer at all. The stage rattled over a frozen rut hard enough to jostle them both, and somewhere up front the driver swore at the horses. "I've spent 32 years building a life that made sense on paper," Caleb said finally. "Land, cattle, work that needed doing every day, so I never had to sit still long enough to wonder if there was something missing from it. And then you showed up asking why I'd never married. And I gave you an answer I didn't know I had in me, and ever since then I haven't been able to stop turning it over." He paused. "I think some part of me knew that if I let you go on that train alone, and something happened to you, or you didn't come back, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd have found out if I'd just gone with you instead of staying behind doing the safe thing." Elena didn't say anything right away. The light outside had gone from gold to a deep blue gray, the sun dropping fast behind the mountains the way it did in winter, stealing the day before you were ready for it to go. "That's the most you've ever said to me at once," she said finally, and there was a small, tired smile in it. "Don't expect it to become a habit," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised out of her, the first one he'd heard from her since the letter had come. It didn't last long, but it changed something in the cramped, cold space of that stagecoach, made it feel less like 2 strangers thrown together by circumstance and more like something else, something neither of them had a name for yet. The train east was worse in some ways and better in others. Worse because the cars were crowded with people making the same desperate winter trips for their own reasons. A soldier heading home on leave, a family relocating after a failed homestead claim, an older woman traveling alone to bury a sister. And the close quarters left little privacy for either of them to process what they were each carrying. Better because there was, at least, heat, and seats that didn't jolt every few seconds. and a kind of forced stillness that gave them hours with nothing to do but talk, or not talk, depending on what either of them could manage. It was on the second night of the rail journey, somewhere past the Dakota line, with the windows fogged from the cold outside pressing against the warmth within, that Elena told him about her father. "He wasn't an easy man to love," she said, watching the frost patterns on the glass rather than looking at Caleb directly. "Not unkind, just distant, particular. He had ideas about what a daughter should become, and teaching school in the middle of nowhere, Montana was not anywhere on that list." She paused. "When I told him I'd taken the position, he didn't speak to me for 3 days. My mother finally got him to write me a letter wishing me well, but I always knew it was more her doing than his." "And now he's asking for you," Caleb said. "Now he's asking for me." Her voice caught slightly. "I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means he's forgiven me for leaving or if he's just frightened, and frightened people ask for whoever's left to ask for." She finally turned to look at Caleb. "Is that a terrible thing to think about my own father?" "No," Caleb said. "It's an honest thing. Those aren't always the same as terrible." She studied him for a moment. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Make hard things sound less like failures." She shook her head slightly, like she was working something out. "I don't know how you do it. Most people, when you tell them something ugly about yourself, they rush to tell you it isn't really ugly at all, that you're wrong to think it. You just sit with it, like it's allowed to be what it is." "Things are usually what they are whether we allow it or not," Caleb said. "Seems like less work to just look at them straight." She was quiet for a while after that, watching the dark fields slide past the frosted glass, the rhythm of the train beneath them steady and tireless. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" she said eventually. "You can." "I'm afraid he's going to die before I get there," she said, the words coming out fast now, like she'd been holding them back with effort, and the dam had finally given. "I'm afraid I'm going to spend 2 more days on this train, and then arrive, and find out I missed it by hours. And I don't know what I'll do with that. I don't know how a person carries something like that." Caleb reached across the small space between their seats. Not far, not a grand gesture, just close enough, and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. "You'll carry it the way people carry everything," he said. "Slow and badly some days, and better other days. But you won't carry it alone. Not this leg of it, anyway." She looked down at his hand over hers, then up at his face, and something passed between them that neither one of them tried to put words to. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't move his. The train rolled on through the dark, carrying them both toward whatever was waiting on the other end of all that distance. A sick man in a Boston house, a family braced for either relief or grief, and 2 people who had started this journey as not much more than acquaintances and were arriving at something neither of them had a name for yet, but that was, mile by mile, becoming impossible to mistake for anything else. They reached Boston on the 4th day, the train pulling into a station so loud and crowded that Caleb found himself instinctively reaching for Elena's elbow to keep her close in the crush of people, a gesture he hadn't planned and didn't apologize for. She didn't pull away. Her father hadn't died. That much they learned within minutes from a driver her mother had sent to meet the train. A thin, nervous man named Joseph who'd worked for the Whitlock family for years and who delivered the news the way servants learned to deliver news, careful and measured, neither too hopeful nor too grim. Mr. Whitlock was alive. Mr. Whitlock was weak. Mr. Whitlock had been asking, in the brief periods when he was lucid, whether the telegram had reached his daughter. Elena's whole body seemed to sag with relief at the words, and then tighten right back up with a different kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing the worst hasn't happened yet, but understanding it still might. The Whitlock house was nothing like anything Caleb had ever stood inside of. 3 stories of brick and dark wood, a front hall bigger than his whole kitchen, paintings in heavy frames that seemed to watch him as he walked beneath them. He felt, immediately and completely, like a man who had wandered somewhere he wasn't built for. His boots too loud on the polished floor, his coat too rough for the room he was standing in. Elena's mother met them in the front hall. She was a tall woman, composed in the way that comes from years of practice rather than nature, though the composure cracked the moment she saw her daughter. She crossed the hall fast and pulled Elena into an embrace that neither of them seemed to want to end. "You came," Margaret Whitlock said into her daughter's shoulder. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to." Of course I came. Elena's voice was thick. How is he? Sleeping, finally. Dr. Allenby gave him something for the pain an hour ago. Margaret Whitlock pulled back, looked her daughter over with the assessing eye of a mother checking for damage, and only then seemed to notice Caleb standing a few feet back, hat in hand, doing his best to look like he belonged somewhere in this house. And who is this? She asked, not unkindly, but with the particular careful tone that Caleb recognized immediately as the sound of a question that was actually several questions at once. This is Caleb Mercer, Elena said. He has a ranch near Red Hollow. He came with me. I couldn't have made the trip alone. Not in this weather, not with everything. She stopped herself, seemed to realize she was explaining more than her mother had actually asked for, and finished simply, He helped me get here. Margaret Whitlock studied Caleb for a long moment. Caleb let her, since there wasn't much else to do with that kind of look except stand still under it and let it run its course. Thank you, Mr. Mercer, she said finally. That was a kindness. Wasn't entirely kindness, Caleb said. Wasn't going to let her travel that far alone if I could help it. Something flickered across Margaret Whitlock's face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, filed away for later consideration. We have a room you can stay in, she said. It isn't much trouble, the house is large enough. You'll forgive us if things are somewhat in disarray. We haven't had much occasion to think about guests these past several days. Don't need much, Caleb said. Appreciate it all the same. Elena's father, Edmund Whitlock, woke the next morning, and the household rearranged itself around that fact the way a house rearranges itself around any serious illness. Quiet voices, careful footsteps, doors that were left ajar so someone could hear if something changed. Caleb didn't go up to see him. It wasn't his place, and he understood that without anyone needing to tell him. Instead, he found himself in the kitchen with the housekeeper, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Hattie, who took one look at him standing awkwardly near the doorway and put him to work splitting kindling in the backyard, on the theory, never stated but clearly held, that an idle man in someone else's house only got more in the way the longer he stood around with nothing to do. He was glad for the work. It was the most comfortable he'd felt since stepping off the train. He was out there for the better part of an hour, working through a pile of wood that probably hadn't needed splitting so much as it had needed a man with nervous energy and no clear outlet for it, when Elena came out the back door wrapped in a coat that, unlike the one she'd brought to Montana, actually looked warm enough for the weather. You don't have to do that, she said. Hattie put me to it. Hattie puts everyone to something. It's how she manages her own worry. Elena came closer, watching him swing the axe with an economy of motion that came from 30 years of practice. He's awake. He's weak, but he's talking. The doctor says it could have been much worse. His heart, not his lungs, which apparently matters a great deal, though I confess I don't fully understand why. That's good news, Caleb said, setting the axe down. It is. She didn't sound entirely convinced, and he caught it. But, she let out a breath. But he asked about you, specifically. Wanted to know who the man was that Mother mentioned, the one who'd traveled with me. I think word reached him before I'd even decided what to say about it. And what did you say? The truth. That you're a rancher from Montana, and that you escorted me here because you didn't think I should make the trip alone. She paused. He wants to meet you, this afternoon, if you're willing. He's weak, but he insists, and arguing with him in his condition seems unwise for everyone involved. Caleb looked down at the axe in his hand, the small mountain of split wood beside him, and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. All right, he said. Bata. Edmund Whitlock looked smaller in the bed than Caleb had expected, though he supposed most men look smaller when illness has had its way with them for a few days. He had Elena's directness in his eyes, even weakened as he was. The same way of looking at a person like he was trying to read past whatever they'd decided to show him. Mr. Mercer, Edmund said, his voice thin but clear. Sit, if you would. I don't have the strength to crane my neck looking up at you. Caleb sat in the chair beside the bed. Elena hovered near the door, not quite leaving, not quite staying, caught between wanting to be present and understanding that this conversation might go better without her standing over it. Elena tells me you have a ranch, Edmund said. Yes, sir, near Red Hollow, Montana. About 2,000 acres, give or take, cattle, mostly. And you left it, in winter. To bring my daughter 2,000 miles east. I did. Why? It was the same question, in its way, that Elena had asked him in the stagecoach that first night, and Caleb found himself reaching for the same honesty that had gotten him this far. Because I didn't think she should make that trip alone, with everything she was carrying, and because I've come to care for her in a way I wasn't expecting and don't entirely know what to do with. He held Edmund's gaze. I'm not going to tell you I came here with some plan worked out, sir. I didn't. I came because the alternative, staying home, knowing she was out there alone and afraid for you, sat worse with me than anything else I could think to do instead. Edmund Whitlock studied him for a long moment. In the silence, Caleb could hear Elena's breathing from the doorway, careful and shallow, the sound of someone trying not to be noticed, listening. You understand, Edmund said slowly, that my daughter has built a life I don't fully understand, in a place I've never seen, doing work I confess I once thought beneath what she was capable of. I wanted more for her. A life in this city, married into a good family, comfort, ease, things I could see and measure and know she'd be provided for. I understand that, sir. And you're a rancher. A good one, I don't doubt, from the way you carry yourself. But that life, the one you're offering, if that's what this is, it's hard. It's isolated. It's nothing like what I pictured for her. No, Caleb agreed. It isn't. Then convince me, Edmund said. And there was an edge under the weakness in his voice now, the ghost of whatever sharpness had made him successful enough to own a house like this one. Convince me that what you're offering is worth what she'd be giving up. Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning the question over the way he turned over most things that mattered, slowly, without rushing toward an answer just because one was expected. I can't, he said finally. Edmund's eyebrows went up slightly, the first real reaction he'd shown. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Montana is better than Boston, because it isn't, not in the ways you're measuring it, Caleb continued. There's no theater, no fine houses with paintings on the walls. The winters will try to kill you some years, and they very nearly have, more than once, in my own life. If your daughter married me, she'd be trading all this. He gestured around the room without contempt, just acknowledgement, for a house that's smaller than your front hall, and work that doesn't end with the seasons, and a town that's slow to trust anyone who isn't from there already. That's a poor argument for yourself, Mr. Mercer. It's not an argument. It's the truth. Same as I gave Elena when she asked me a hard question I didn't expect to answer honestly. I'm not going to lie to you to win you over, sir, because then the only thing I'd have proven is that I'm willing to lie when it suits me, and that's not something I want either of you to believe about me. Caleb leaned forward slightly. What I can tell you is that I'd build whatever life she wanted, as much as it's in my power to build it. If she wanted the school to keep growing, I'd put up the lumber for a new building myself. If she wanted to come back here every year to see you, I'd find the money and the time for the trip, whatever it cost. I'm not asking her to give up who she is for me. I'm asking to be part of however she decides to keep being that person. The room was quiet. Elena had gone very still in the doorway. Edmund Whitlock looked at Caleb for a long time, the kind of look that seemed to be doing real work, weighing something with more care than his weakened state probably should have allowed. You didn't promise me an easy life for her, he said finally. No, sir. Most men in your position trying to win over a sick father would have promised exactly that. Most men would be lying, Caleb said. Something that might have been a laugh, weak and short, escaped from Edmund's chest. You're either the most honest man who's ever sat in that chair or the most calculating one I've met in years, pretending honesty because you've worked out it's what I'd respond to. I suppose you'll have to decide which for yourself, Caleb said. I can't prove it to you any way but time. Edmund's eyes drifted toward the doorway, found his daughter standing there with her hand pressed against the frame, her composure clearly costing her something to maintain. Elena, he said, come here. She came and sat on the edge of the bed, took her father's hand in both of hers. Are you in love with this man? Edmund asked her directly, the bluntness of it making Caleb's chest go tight. Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked over at Caleb, really looked, the way she'd looked at him by the river, at the dinner table, on the train in the dark. And something passed across her face that hadn't fully settled into words yet, not even for herself. I think I might be, she said quietly. I haven't let myself say it before now. It's happened faster than I expected and in a place I wasn't looking for it, and I haven't entirely made peace with what that means. And does he make you happy? He makes me feel like myself, Elena said. More myself than I've felt anywhere. Maybe even here. That's not quite the same question you asked, but it's the truest answer I have. Edmund was quiet for a moment, his thumb moving absently against the back of his daughter's hand. Your mother said something similar to me once, he said finally. A long time ago. About a man her own father didn't approve of. He paused. That man was me. Elena looked up, startled. I never knew that. There's a great deal you don't know about your mother and me, Edmund said, a tired smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps it's time you learn some of it. Later. When I have more strength for storytelling. His gaze shifted back to Caleb. I won't pretend my blessing means as much as it once might have, Mr. Mercer. My daughter has never asked my permission for anything in her life, and I don't expect that to start now. But I'll tell you this. A man who tells a dying man's family the truth instead of what they want to hear is a rarer thing than you might realize. I'd rather see her with someone honest in a hard life than someone false in an easy one. Thank you, sir, Caleb said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. Don't thank me yet, Edmund said, his voice fading now, the effort of the conversation clearly catching up with him. Ask me again when I'm not lying in a sickbed, feeling sentimental about my own mortality. I reserve the right to be considerably more difficult once I'm well enough to argue properly. Edmund Whitlock did not die. Over the following 2 weeks, under Dr. Allenby's careful supervision and his wife's relentless management of his diet and rest, he improved steadily, slowly at first, then with the kind of momentum that made the household exhale collectively, the tight, unspoken dread that had been sitting in every room finally starting to loosen its grip. Caleb stayed through all of it. He helped where he could. More wood splitting, repairs to a fence around the back garden that Hattie mentioned needed doing, small, useful labors that gave him purpose in a house where he otherwise felt like a man standing in rooms built for different lives than his own. He learned the rhythms of the household. He learned that Margaret Whitlock took her tea precisely at 4 and grew anxious if it was late. He learned that Hattie's gruffness covered a deep well of genuine care, and that she'd taken to leaving him extra portions at meals without comment, which he understood to be her way of approving of him. He and Elena found time, and the gaps between her father's care and her mother's need for company, and the general suspended quality of a household waiting to see which way a sickness would break. Time to walk in the small garden behind the house, time to sit in the parlor after the rest of the household had gone to bed, time to keep talking the way they'd started talking on that train, peeling back one more layer each time, finding it didn't get harder the more they did it, only easier. You were good with him, Elena said one evening, the two of them sitting near the parlor fire while the rest of the house slept. My father. I expected you to flounder. Most people flounder with him. I wasn't trying to win anything, Caleb said. Just trying to tell him the truth and see what he did with it. That's what made it work, I think. She pulled her knees up under her, the firelight catching the side of her face. He spent his whole life around men who tell him what he wants to hear, because he has money and influence, and people learn quickly that flattery gets further with him than honesty does. I think it unsettled him more than anything, having someone sit in that chair and refuse to do that. Wasn't trying to unsettle him either. I know. She smiled, small and tired and real. That's why it worked. He looked at her in the firelight, the way the orange glow softened the exhaustion that had been sitting in her face since the letter first arrived, and felt something settle into place inside him that he hadn't fully expected to feel. Not relief exactly, though there was relief in it, but something steadier than that, something that felt less like falling and more like arriving. Elena, he said. Yes? I'm not going to ask you anything tonight, he said. Your father's still healing, and this isn't the moment for it, and I don't want whatever I'm feeling right now to push you towards something you're not ready to decide. But I want you to know, when the moment does come, I intend to ask you something. I think you already know what. She didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, the house quiet and dark around them, 2,000 miles from the only home either one of them had built before now. I think I do know, she said finally, and I think, when that moment comes, you already know what I'll say. Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The fire burned low, and outside the window the Boston snow fell soft and steady over a city that neither of them belonged to, while inside something had quietly, undeniably, already been decided. They left Boston in the second week of December. Once Edmund Whitlock was steady enough on his feet to argue with his wife about whether he was steady enough on his feet, which everyone in the household took as a reliable sign that the worst had passed. The goodbye at the train station was longer than any of them expected, Margaret Whitlock holding her daughter for a full minute without speaking, Edmund gripping Caleb's hand with more strength than a man 2 weeks off a sickbed had any right to. "Take care of her," Edmund said. "And take care of yourself. I find I'd like the chance to argue with you again someday, Mr. Mercer, once I've got my full wits back." "Looking forward to it, sir," Caleb said, and meant it. The trip back felt different than the trip out. Less urgent, certainly. There was no letter pulling them forward, no fear gnawing at the edges of every mile, but something else had changed too, something neither of them named outright, but that showed itself in small ways. The way Elena leaned her head against his shoulder without asking permission somewhere in Ohio, sleeping through a stretch of frozen flatland she barely remembered afterward. The way Caleb found himself reaching for her hand at train platforms without thinking about it first. The gesture coming naturally where 2 weeks earlier it would have required a decision. By the time the train crossed back into Montana, the mountains rising up pale and sharp against a hard blue sky, something between them had settled into a shape that didn't need explaining anymore. They didn't talk about marriage outright. Caleb had said he'd wait for the right moment, and he meant to keep that, even with the shape of his intention sitting plainly between them on every mile of that final stretch. But there was an ease now, a kind of certainty underneath the ordinary conversation that made the unspoken thing feel less like a question and more like something they were both simply walking toward. Red Hollow looked exactly the same as they'd left it. Smaller buildings, narrower streets, the whole town dusted under a fresh layer of snow that had fallen while they were gone. And yet it felt different to step back into it, the way familiar places sometimes feel different after you've been somewhere far enough away to see your own life from a distance. The ranch had survived without him mostly. Pete and Dennis had kept the herd fed and the worst of the winter damage to a minimum, though there was a section of the north barn roof that had partially given way under an early snow load, and one of the older cows had died of something neither brother could diagnose with certainty. "Could have been worse," Pete said, walking the property with Caleb the morning after he got back, breath fogging between them. "Lot worse, actually. Storm came through about a week after you left, dropped near 2 feet in a day. We lost some fence on the east side, but the cattle held up all right." "You did good," Caleb said, and Pete looked pleased in the quiet way men who don't expect praise look pleased when they get it anyway. The school was a different matter entirely, and Caleb heard about it before Elena did, which put him in the uncomfortable position of deciding whether to warn her or let her walk into it cold. He chose to warn her, the morning after they'd both settled back into town, finding her at Ruth Penner's boarding house over coffee that Ruth had made strong enough to apologize for. "There's been talk," he said. "There's always talk," Elena said. "You'll have to be more specific." "About the school, about you, and the wedding folks are expecting once it happens." He turned his cup slowly on the table. "Some of the families are saying that once you're married, you'll quit teaching. Settle into the house, raise children, the way most wives out here do. A few of them have already started asking Arthur about finding a new teacher for the fall term, just in case." Elena set her cup down with more force than the moment strictly required. "Without asking me," she said. "Without asking you," Caleb confirmed. "I haven't even agreed to marry you yet," she said, and there was real heat in it now, not directed at him exactly, but close enough to make him sit up a little straighter. "And already half this town has decided what happens to my life the moment I do." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not telling you this to upset you. I'm telling you because I think you'd rather know than be surprised by it at the feed store." She was quiet for a moment, working through the anger, and when she spoke again, her voice had leveled out, though the edge hadn't gone anywhere, just gone steadier. "Who's saying it?" "Dorothy Fenn, mostly. A few of the other women. Not out of meanness, far as I can tell. Just out of how things have always been done here. A married woman runs a household. Teaching's something you do until you're married, then you hand it off." He paused. "Doesn't mean it has to go that way. Just means people are already assuming it will." "And what do you think it should mean?" Elena asked, And there was a test in the question, the kind of test he understood now to be a fundamental part of how she moved through the world. Not a trap, just an honest desire to know where he actually stood, rather than where he thought she wanted him to stand. I think you built something at that schoolhouse that this town needed long before you got here, and is going to keep needing long after, Caleb said. I think the Briggs boy and the Crow girls and half the Halverson family owe you something this town hasn't found the words to thank you for properly yet. And I think if you want to keep teaching after we're married, and I'm saying when, not if, because I intend to ask you properly soon, and I think you already know, my answer to whether you should keep working is going to be yes, regardless of what anybody else expects. Then you keep teaching, and anybody who's got an opinion about it can bring it to me instead of whispering it at the feed store. Elena looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't fully read. You'd really stand against the whole town over this? She asked. Wouldn't be standing against the whole town, Caleb said. Just the part of it that's wrong. So, the conversation that mattered most happened 3 days later, at a town meeting Arthur Fenn had called under the pretense of discussing the spring planting schedule, but that everyone understood by the time half of Red Hollow had crowded into the back room of the store was really about the schoolteacher and her future. Dorothy Fenn raised it first, carefully, the way people raise things they've already decided on, but want to seem reasonable about. We just think it's worth discussing now before the wedding, rather than scrambling come fall, she said. If Miss Whitlock is going to be married and keeping a house, it stands to reason the district will need to start looking for a replacement teacher. Better to plan ahead than be caught short. A murmur of agreement moved through part of the room. Not everyone. Caleb caught Ruth Penner's expression tightening, saw Arthur himself looking distinctly uncomfortable at having let the conversation arrive exactly where he'd half suspected it would, but enough people to make clear this wasn't just Dorothy's private opinion. Elena stood up before Caleb could say anything, which didn't surprise him in the slightest. I appreciate the district's concern for planning ahead, she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the crowded room. But I haven't resigned my position, and I don't intend to. If and when Mr. Mercer and I marry, I expect to keep teaching at that school for as long as the district will have me. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something's been said that nobody quite expected to hear, stated so plainly. That's not how it's usually done, Dorothy said, less certain now but still pressing. A married woman, with a household to run. With respect, Mrs. Fenn, Elena said, I've run a household before. I've also taught 23 children 5 days a week through a Montana winter while doing it. I don't think the two are as incompatible as folks assume. I think they've just never been asked to coexist before, because nobody's tried. It was Margaret Pruitt, of all people, who spoke up next. Margaret, who knew more gossip than anyone in town and had never been shy about repeating it, surprising everyone by standing and turning to face the room directly. My grandson is reading now, she said. Wasn't reading a word before this woman came to town. I don't much care who he learns it from once he's already learning it, but I'll tell you this. If this district decides to push out a teacher this good because some folks think a wedding ring changes what a woman's capable of, then this district's got more foolishness in it than sense. A ripple moved through the room at that. Not quite agreement from everyone, but enough heads nodding that Dorothy visibly recalculated her position. Then Henrietta Halverson stood, the boy's mother, the same woman who'd once declared book learning less useful than mending a harness. My boys used to fight me every morning about going to that school, she said. Now they fight me about staying home when they're sick. I don't know what Miss Whitlock does in that room, but I know what it's done for my family, and I'm not interested in losing it over an old habit of thinking that never made much sense to begin with. She looked directly at Dorothy. Maybe it's time some of those habits got reconsidered. Caleb stood then, not because he needed to add much to what had already been said, but because he wanted it understood plainly where he stood, in front of everyone. No ambiguity left for anyone to whisper about later. I'll say this once, and then I'll sit back down, he said. Whatever happens between Miss Whitlock and myself is our business, but I'll tell you straight. I'm not marrying a woman so she can stop being who she already is. I'm marrying her because of who she already is. If anybody in this room thinks a wedding band changes the value of what she does in that schoolhouse, you're wrong, and I'd ask you to think harder about why you believe it in the first place. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the awkward, retreating silence from a moment ago, but something more settled, more like a collective recalculation arriving at a new and better answer. Arthur Fenn, looking distinctly relieved to have the conversation moving somewhere other than where it had started, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "I'd say that settles the planning question for the district then, unless anybody's got further business about it." Nobody did. Dorothy Fenn didn't apologize outright. That wasn't really in her nature, Caleb had noticed over the years, but she did approach Elena afterward, while people were filing out into the cold, and said something quiet that made Elena's expression soften considerably. And whatever it was, it seemed to close the matter as far as Elena was concerned, which was good enough for Caleb. Outside, the snow had started again, light and fine, catching in the lamplight outside the store. Elena pulled her coat tight, a new one, heavier, that Caleb had quietly arranged through Arthur weeks before they'd left for Boston, and that she'd found waiting in her room the day they returned, though she'd said nothing about it beyond a long look that told him she understood exactly what it meant. "That was harder than I expected," she said, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. "Standing up in front of all of them like that." "You did it anyway." "I did it anyway," she agreed. "Mostly because I had help I wasn't expecting. Margaret Pruitt, of all people." "People surprise you," Caleb said. "Town like this, you spend years thinking you know exactly where everybody stands, and then something like tonight happens, and half of them turn out to have more sense than you gave them credit for." She looked at him for a long moment, snow settling on her shoulders, on the brim of his hat, the lamplight from the store window throwing a warm gold rectangle onto the white ground between them. "You didn't have to say what you said in there," she said, "about marrying me because of who I am, not despite it." "I said it because it's true," Caleb said. "Same reason I've said most things to you since that first night at Arthur's table." "I know," she said, and something in her voice had gone soft in a way he hadn't heard from her before. Not even on the train, not even in her father's parlor with the fire burning low. "I think that's why I trust it." They stood there a moment longer in the falling snow, the town settling into its evening quiet around them, Red Hollow having just argued its way, however clumsily, toward a better version of itself than it had been a few hours earlier, and neither one of them in any particular hurry to be the one who broke the stillness first. Winter held on longer than usual that year, stubborn, the way Montana winters could be when they hadn't quite finished saying what they had to say, but by the middle of March the snow had started pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Caleb's property broke its ice with a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. He proposed to her at the river. He hadn't planned the location with any particular ceremony in mind. It was simply the place that made sense to him, the flat rock where he'd first sat down beside her without intending to, the spot where she'd told him the sky here felt less like falling and more like room. He'd thought about it for weeks, turning over what he wanted to say, and had arrived, in the end, at the same conclusion he usually arrived at when he overthought something, that the plain truth, said plainly, was the only version of himself worth offering her. She was marking papers again when he found her there, the same stack of spelling tests, though Tom Briggs was apparently still spelling everything correctly, and a few new students had joined the rolls since the worst of winter eased. "You're going to wear a groove in that rock," Caleb said, sitting down on the log across from her, the same log as before. "It's a good rock for thinking," she said, not looking up. "I've been doing some thinking myself." Something in his tone made her set the papers down. She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her go very still, the way a person goes still when they sense something important is arriving and they don't want to miss any part of it. "Elena," he said, and his voice wasn't as steady as he'd practiced it being, which he decided afterward was probably for the best. Steadiness would have felt rehearsed, and nothing about what he felt for her had ever been rehearsed. "I told your father I didn't have a plan worked out when I got on that train with you. That was true then. It isn't true anymore. I've thought about this every day since we got back, and probably most days before that too, if I'm being honest with myself." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. Simple, not much to look at, made by a jeweler in Billings from a description Caleb had given him weeks earlier. Nothing close to what she could have had back in Boston. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, "not because I think I can give you an easy life, because I can't, and I won't pretend otherwise, but because I think I can give you an honest one. I'll stand behind your teaching as long as you want to teach. I'll build whatever you need built, and I'll keep telling you the truth, even when it's hard, for as long as you'll have me." Elena looked at the ring, then at him, and her eyes had gone bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You already know what I'm going to say," she said softly. "I'd still like to hear you say it." "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and certain, no hesitation in it at all. "Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't entirely steady, and she laughed, that real laugh, the one he'd only heard a handful of times, and pulled him into her without waiting for him to make the first move, the way she'd done most things since the day she'd crouched down in front of a dog nobody else dared get close to. They married in May, in the schoolhouse, because Elena had insisted on it half as a joke and half completely seriously, and because by the time the wedding rolled around, nobody in Red Hollow found the choice strange at all. The children Elena taught had decorated the room themselves, wildflowers crammed into jars Ruth Penner had donated, paper chains the younger ones had cut and strung along the windows with more enthusiasm than precision. Tom Briggs gave Elena away, in a sense, walking her down the narrow aisle between the desks, since she had no father present to do it. Edmund Whitlock had wanted to make the trip, but his recovery, steady as it had been, hadn't yet given him the strength for a journey that long, and he'd written instead a letter that Elena read alone in her room the night before and didn't share the contents of with anyone, though she came out with red eyes and a soft, settled look that told Caleb whatever was in it had been good. The whole town came. Dorothy Fenn cried, which surprised everyone, including, by the look on her face, Dorothy herself. Margaret Pruitt told 3 different versions of how the couple had met by the end of the evening, none of them quite accurate, all of them generous. The Halverson boys got into a minor scuffle near the punch table that their father broke up with the weary efficiency of a man who'd done it 100 times before. Pete and Dennis Rourke stood near the back, looking deeply uncomfortable in their good clothes, and deeply pleased at the same time, an expression only ranch hands seemed able to manage. It wasn't an elaborate wedding. There was no orchestra, no grand cathedral, nothing close to what a Boston society wedding might have looked like. But standing at the front of that single-room schoolhouse, surrounded by the children Elena had pulled back from the edges of their own lives, and the people who'd finally, grudgingly, generously come around to seeing what Caleb had seen in her from the start, neither one of them could imagine wanting it any other way. The years that followed weren't easy, because nothing about ranch life or school teaching or marriage in general ever promised to be easy, and Caleb would have distrusted anyone who told him otherwise. There were hard seasons. A drought in their 3rd year together that thinned the herd more than either of them liked to think about, that had Caleb up at all hours hauling water to stock tanks that the dry creek couldn't fill on its own. A fever that swept through Red Hollow the winter their first child, a girl they named Sarah, after Caleb's mother, was barely a year old. A fever that took 2 children in town and came close enough to taking their own that Caleb spent 3 nights sitting beside a small bed not sleeping at all. Elena beside him doing the same, both of them too afraid to say out loud what they were afraid of. There were arguments, real ones, about money and about how much of the ranch work Elena should still be doing once the children came, about whether the school needed a real building with real walls before another roof gave way under snow. Arguments that didn't resolve themselves neatly in a single conversation the way arguments in stories sometimes do. But that got worked through the slow, unglamorous way most things in a marriage get worked through, with patience some days and short tempers other days, and eventually with both of them still standing on the same side of whatever the problem had been. But there was also this. Elena kept teaching. The school grew. By their 5th year together, the single room had become 2. Paid for partly by district funds, Arthur Fenn had finally managed to wrangle out of the territorial government, and partly by Caleb's own lumber and labor, donated without much fuss because that was simply what needed doing, and he'd never been a man who needed to be asked twice. Tom Briggs, grown into a serious, steady young man, came back from a stint working a logging operation up north to help teach the older boys their letters and numbers, having decided somewhere along the way that what Elena had given him was worth passing along. The Crow girls, grown now too, both ended up teaching in towns of their own eventually, something Elena talked about with a quiet, fierce pride that Caleb recognized because he felt something close to it himself, watching what she'd built ripple outward into places she'd never even visited. Caleb's ranch grew too, slowly and unglamorously, the way ranches actually grow rather than the way stories like to pretend they grow. A few more acres here, a better breeding line there, Pete and Dennis eventually bringing their own families onto the land, building small houses of their own near the main one, until what had once been one quiet man's solitary inheritance had become something closer to a small community in itself. They had 3 children in all: Sarah, then a boy named Edmund, after Elena's father, who'd finally made the trip out to Montana once when Edmund was 3 years old and had cried, unashamedly, at the size of the sky the same way his daughter once had. And then a younger daughter, Margaret, named half for Elena's mother and half, with some embarrassment, for Margaret Pruitt, who'd taken to that honor with more grace and considerably less gossip than anyone expected. There came an evening, years later, when Caleb sat on the porch of the house he'd built and rebuilt and expanded twice over the course of his marriage. Watching the sun go down behind the same mountains, he'd watched it go down behind his entire life. And Elena came out and sat beside him the way she had 1,000 evenings before that one, and neither of them said much of anything for a while, which by then had become its own kind of conversation, the comfortable kind that doesn't need filling. "Sarah asked me something today," Elena said eventually. "At the schoolhouse. One of the younger boys had asked her how her parents met, and she came and asked me to tell it properly, since apparently the version she'd pieced together from town gossip had gotten somewhat tangled." "What'd you tell her?" "The truth," Elena said, smiling slightly. "That her father drove me halfway across the country because he was too stubborn to let me go alone, and that somewhere in the middle of that very long, very cold trip, we both figured out we didn't want to go back to living separate lives once it was over." Caleb thought about that for a moment. The schoolhouse dinner table? The question she'd asked him that he hadn't expected to answer honestly. The train rattling through the dark with her hand under his, her father's sick room. The town meeting where half of Red Hollow had argued its way toward something better than where it started. "That's about the size of it," he said. "I used to think," Elena said, looking out at the darkening fields, "that courage meant doing something dramatic, some single brave moment that changed everything at once. I think I believed that growing up, that bravery looked like a grand gesture, one decision that settled the matter forever." She turned to look at him. "But it wasn't one moment for us, was it? It was 100 small, honest ones, stacked up one after another. You telling me the truth at that dinner table when a lie would have been easier. Me deciding to ask the question in the first place instead of staying polite. You getting on that train. Both of us standing in front of this whole town and saying what we actually believed instead of what would have been comfortable to say. I think most things worth having get built that way," Caleb said. "Slow and mostly unremarkable. Except that you keep choosing the harder, true thing instead of the easier, false one, over and over, until one day you look up and realize you've built something nobody could have built any faster." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had on that first train ride east all those years ago. And they sat like that as the light went from gold to blue to the deep, star-thick dark that Montana skies kept in greater supply than almost anywhere else on Earth. Inside the house, their children's voices carried faintly from the kitchen. An argument breaking out over whose turn it was to feed the dog settled the way most small arguments in that household eventually got settled, with somebody's older sister stepping in, calm and certain, the same way her mother had once settled a half-wild dog on a dusty road outside a schoolhouse, simply by refusing to run. Red Hollow had changed too, over those years, in ways large and small. The school Elena had built from 12 frightened, skeptical students into something the whole district pointed to with pride. The quiet, unspoken shift in how the town thought about what a married woman could be, a shift that had started with one uncomfortable meeting in the back of Arthur Fenn's store and had spread slowly the way good changes tend to spread, through example rather than argument. Families who'd once doubted that the frontier and ambition could share the same house now sent their own daughters to Elena's classroom, hoping for some of whatever she'd been carrying since the day she arrived. None of it had happened because of one perfect decision or one dramatic turn of fate. It had happened because 2 imperfect people had kept choosing honesty over the easier, comfortable lie, again and again, in rooms big and small, in front of crowds and in private, until the choosing became simply who they were. The sun finished its descent behind the mountains. The lamps came on in the kitchen window behind them, warm and yellow, against the coming dark. And Caleb Mercer, 32 years old when a school teacher from Boston had asked him a question he'd spent his whole life avoiding, sat on his own porch with his own family close by and the woman he loved beside him, and understood finally and completely that the life he'd been afraid he didn't deserve had turned out to be exactly the one he'd been building toward all along. He just hadn't known it until somebody brave enough finally asked,